Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us this evening. We have a great segment planned for you with a good friend who's going to talk about the importance of vote by mail. Jason Kander was a former Secretary of State for the state of Missouri. He was a Senate candidate, lost one of the tightest races in the country. He is a combat veteran, mental health advocate, and has dedicated himself now to expanding the right to vote and founded an organization called Let America Vote. He's going to talk to us this evening about the importance of vote by mail as a critical initiative and way to try to protect access to the polls for American voters, but critically how important it is now in the midst of a pandemic as we're uncertain as to what might happen come the fall. So tune on in, and Jason, thanks for joining us.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Really grateful that you're here to walk through what a vote by mail operation means, and really more than anything to start, just talk about Americans' access to the ballot box. And you're the founder of Let America Vote, but over your course of your travels and your advocacy over the course of the past couple of years, how accessible is that ballot box, and what does it mean to try to be able to vote in the midst of a pandemic?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the right way to ask it. You kind of got to start with where we were before the lockdown and then what's happening now. So there's sort of two angles to it. First, let's just start with the sort of status quo usual situation in America with voting. And it's basically a big fight between two forces. You've got the right, which likes to portray this as a policy disagreement. They want people to think that this is no different than education or healthcare. It's just, two different ideological views about how things happen, but that's not what's going on at all. It's a power struggle, right? I mean, it is the right looking at the demographics and the trends of the country and saying, boy, when more people have access to the ballot, we tend to lose a lot more elections. So it's a fight over whether or not to grant people access. And so you end up with two very different views. And one of those views portrays voters as criminal suspects. Anybody who wants to vote, that's very suspicious. And we've got to look very closely at what that motivation is about and treat them like a criminal suspect. And then you've got the other side of the coin, the left, and progressives generally, who tend to look at it more as a customer service issue. It's something that every American should participate in, that we want every American to participate in. And everybody is experiencing more and more customer service in their daily lives, right? Like there are places where you can order something online and have it show up later that day. So there's an expectation among voters that things should actually work and that they should be convenient. And you've got our side of the aisle wanting to meet that expectation. So that's really where things were prior to all this. And now it's like put under a microscope, because now you've got that customer service argument being one of protecting people's health and protecting the democracy at the same time. And it really puts the other side in a difficult situation, because now they can't just portray it as, oh, well, we're worried about fraud, or, oh, this is a best practices thing. Now they have to also justify it with, here's why we're willing to make people risk their health. And so it's very scary because they seem to be willing to do that. I mean, I think yesterday or the day before, Kentucky, their Republican legislature overrode the governor's veto of a photo ID law, which is a terrible thing that happens a lot. But the law says that you have to go get an ID from the driver's license bureau. The driver's license bureaus in Kentucky are all shut down right now, but that didn't stop them from saying, yeah, you can't vote without this. So it takes these inflection points in our culture of voting, and it just accentuates and amplifies them in a frightening way.
We have seen, however, obviously the exact inverse being true, particularly in the wake of Shelby v. Alabama, where, at least my understanding, about over 900 polling locations were closed throughout the South after the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was struck down. And so the fact is that the way in which parties have tried to approach this and this issue with regards to promotion of the ability to empower people to vote has been fundamentally different. And the president acknowledged that, right? He said recently, when more people vote, Republicans lose, which is a fairly astounding thing for him to admit publicly. But so it goes, right?
Yeah, he said the quiet part out loud. Yeah.
So what does that mean, though, in the midst of a pandemic? I mean, talk to us a little bit about what we saw last week in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so you know, Wisconsin's a really interesting case, right? Because in Wisconsin, they had a big state Supreme Court election going on, and so the governor was like, "Hey, this is really dangerous. We're not going to make people go stand in line right now and vote." And it all came down to the issue of whether or not it counted as an excuse for an excuse-based absentee system to say, "Hey, there's a pandemic. We're not supposed to leave the house." And so then, he was saying, well, we're just going to move this election, right? And the state Supreme Court, which I guess it was a maneuver to try and make sure that the conservative won the election, they were like, no, we're going to go make people vote. Again, banking on the idea that when fewer people go to vote, the conservative is more likely to win. What's really interesting about that is I think in that case, it motivated people and it caused people to go risk their lives to say, no, you're not doing that. My favorite picture from the last few weeks, or at least the most, symbolic picture from the last few weeks, was the long line of voters in Wisconsin, 6 feet apart, and the person with the sign that just said, "This is ridiculous," because it was. And then the progressive ended up winning that race, which is interesting to me because clearly that's one of the things that has changed over the last few years. Back when I started Let America Vote, one of the reasons that I started it was this was not seen as a political issue. It wasn't seen as something that people could get active around or that the average voter could really connect with. It was seen as like a technocratic issue that nerds like us were arguing about. And one of our big missions was to inject this into the political conversation, no different than healthcare, education, or any other issue. And I think what we saw in Wisconsin demonstrates that that's the case, that a lot of people out there are like, hey, I get it. They've made democracy an issue, and I know where I am on the issue of democracy. But it's really scary that in order to try and preserve power, people are willing to not just attack democracy, but like put people's health at risk. I mean, now Trump wants to like potentially get rid of the post office because he's afraid of mail-in voting. I mean, that's nuts, but we got to fight it.
Yeah, we do. And that's where obviously part of this just comes back to the politics on it, to say the way that you fight it is you go out and vote for it, right? And we need people to get motivated and to fight through these things, which is why they're going to keep putting up barrier after barrier after barrier.
And they have to keep putting pressure on not just federal lawmakers, but their state lawmakers as well. And like it sort of brings us to what you've been advocating for in Massachusetts, because it's really important that states that we view as more progressive, leading edge states, that they set an example. That's what Oregon has done. It's what Washington has done. It's what Colorado has done now. And so it's important that Massachusetts not just look at this and say, okay, there's a pandemic. We're going to be responsible. We're going to make sure people get their ballots at home and get an opportunity to vote. But, there's a really good argument to be made that like, also let's make that permanent. People, states like Massachusetts can lead in that way. And it makes a difference because then as more people around the country can look at that and make the comparison and say, oh, well, this is a better way of doing it. Again, going back to that customer service approach to elections, right? It's one of the only things that government does where every single person, there's not very many of these, right? It's like taxes, a few other things where every single person is a customer of that process or can be a customer of that process. And so it's an opportunity to set an example there and to say, look, we're going to do this right. We're going to make sure that folks don't run into encumbrances when they go to vote. So,
great point. And the way that I've been trying to talk about this here in Massachusetts has been making the observation that, look, we don't know. It's April 16th, I think, today. We are supposed to be right in this peak period of the impact of COVID-19 for Eastern Massachusetts. There's other parts of the state that models predict will peak at later times. God willing, we hope that come the summer, we'll be at a much more stable place around the country. Things might be able to open up a bit, and be fluid. But we don't know really at all, if we're being honest about it, what our status is going to be around the country come early September. September 1st is the primary here in Massachusetts, or certainly in November. And if it's a coronavirus, which is a type of virus like the flu, which is seasonal. It mutates every year and comes back, which is why you need to get a seasonal flu shot. We don't know if this is going to come back. By the way, even if this does if the virus does prove to be sensitive to temperature, guess what? It might be warm here in the summer. It's cooler down in the southern hemisphere. So this thing can go through other parts of the world. It's going to come back as air travel continues or starts to, some of those barriers start to lift. We're going to be wrestling with this for sure for months ahead. And so vote by mail, essentially that initiative, I think is so critically important here in Massachusetts and around the country, just to give people the option. It doesn't say you can't go to the polling location, but it just says, hey, if you are in a position where, if you have an underlying health condition, if you happen to be being treated for cancer, if you happen to have diabetes or COPD, if you happen to be sick, if you are concerned that you might get sick, you don't have to go out and stand in line like that guy did holding that sign. Right? I saw one of those pictures of a line multiple blocks long with everybody wearing a face mask waiting to vote. In the United States, this is nuts that we are forcing our people to do this. And so vote by mail just says, look, we'll mail you a ballot, fill it out, send it back, and have you make your voice heard. And we can, in fact, do this going forward. And that's the way we should be preparing ourselves for the potential of what this pandemic could potentially mean for all of us. It ain't that hard.
Yeah, you know, the other piece of this is like there's the voters, but there's also the fact that like the average poll worker is not young. I mean, the average poll worker is 70s, 80s, maybe 60s in some states, but they are the population we're trying to protect. And these are patriotic Americans who are, you know, most of them are still going to show up and do this thing that's so important to them that they do every year. And by the way, the process doesn't work without them. And so the minimizing the amount of people who have to go through that line and stand over those folks and point to their name on the ledger, that's a really important thing to do for our fellow citizens. But it also is, look, I mean, you know, you never want to say like something like this is an opportunity. It's not an opportunity. It's a wake-up call about the fact that this is how we ought to be doing voting. If you look at the states that have the highest turnout in this country, it's largely the states that have the best mail-in operation. It's states that think outside the box about how to do this, but it makes a lot of sense. You know, like for example, in Nevada, in Clark County, one of the things they do is they have on-demand ballot printing, right? So like you can go to any voting center there, and nobody says, "Oh, you're at the wrong place. Go to this place." You know, they don't do that. They just print off the ballot for you wherever you show up. And I'll tell you something funny about that is that I'm glad that that's finally kind of starting to happen some places in America, because when I was Secretary of State of Missouri, I wanted to get that done. And it was all led by this guy from St. Louis, a Republican, by the way, who had created this technology. And I couldn't get anybody to do it anywhere. And then I go to South Korea on like a trade mission as Missouri Secretary of State, and they arrange a meeting for me with their election commissioners for the whole country. And I'm sitting with them, and they're explaining to me how they have on-demand ballot printing at every location, no matter where you are in South Korea. And then they show me an op-ed in a South Korean newspaper by this guy, the guy from St. Louis, Missouri. He's the one who put it in. So I went all the way across the world and found that they have this system that I can't seem to get people to do in my state, comes from my state. I mean, that kind of stuff is so frustrating. Like, we're the democracy people. I mean, heck, Massachusetts, like, talk about somewhere where you should lead, right? I mean, so I'm excited, and I hope they do what you're proposing.
So we're trying, and there's a fair amount of support for it here, and we're trying to go out and make the case as to why this is so, I mean, to your point, this should have been done a long time ago, period. But if it takes the impact of this virus to do so, then maybe that's a potentially pretty thin silver lining given the despair that has been brought on by this thing. But it is potentially a leverage point to actually make this more fair and access to the ballot more equitable. You brought up the point about polling locations and the poll workers, which I think is so critical. Going back to Wisconsin, there's only 180 polling locations in that city. In Milwaukee, there were 5.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't get enough poll workers. And so what does that mean? It means the lines are really long. And what does that mean? It means you can't abide by those social distancing requirements because you got to be in a line blocks long because there's not enough poll workers to actually fully staff the thing, which is going to lead to an election crisis. And the one that I love on this is the critique, which you probably know even more details than I do on it, of saying, hey, if you do this, there's going to be far more voter fraud. One, the data says there's not. 2, much like everything else on the voter fraud false narrative. But 2, you want to talk about voter suppression? How about the idea of actually running an election in the midst of a pandemic where you're saying, hey, in order to have your voice counted, your vote counted, you have to show up and risk your life. Right? What we're essentially saying is this election is going to be decided by either one, those that are willing to risk their lives, two, those that have already had the virus and don't think that they are going to be susceptible to it again. And we narrow the slice of the electorate to those folks and say, that's all right, you go ahead and choose our political leaders for the next 4 years.
Yeah, you know, it kind of reminds me of like when you're in a really close election and there's a huge downpour of rain on election day, and everybody and whoever is like, you know, like when the race is really close, one of the two sides is going to be really upset about that, because what that is like really bad snow, really bad rain. Those are like incumbent protection weather system, right? And so in a way, that's what this is. And so it's very frustrating to me because it really frightens me that this administration may see this as an opportunity to put together like the perfect storm. I hate to carry this analogy too far, but the perfect storm of like of voter suppression. And what's interesting is the reason I was saying a minute ago that it's like an opportunity to put in some of these things that have really needed to exist for a while is because Congress is actually deploying federal funding for this. Like Congress is saying, you know, you all have done a good job of saying like, hey, here's a bunch of money for you to send people ballots. Here's money for you to implement a system that does this. And it's going to every state. But what is frightening to me in the more conservative states is, or like states controlled by Republicans, is that I think that there's going to have to be a whole separate effort of a push by the public to actually get those state governments and those secretaries of state to spend that money. They're going to sit on that money. There's a lot of secretaries of state that are like just going to pretend that that money never showed up and not send ballots out to people at all. And then what I see a lot of them doing right now is they're pretending that it's not their call, right? Like there'll be pressure on them to say, hey, you need to like actually classify this as a valid excuse and allow people to vote absentee because of this. And secretaries of state are saying, well, that's up to the courts. Which, not to get too nerdy on this, but the reason that that's total BS is because the secretaries are the gas and the courts are the brakes. So it's like you can't even have the issue develop for a court to look at it if somebody doesn't say, somebody in government doesn't say, this is how I interpret it. I interpret it to mean this. And then some Republican comes along and sues, and then we decide it. But to say it's decided by the courts is like, it's ridiculous. It's like saying, well, I don't know whether we're going to get there, but you never get in a car to go. And so there's all sorts of things to be concerned about here. And it's why we need our more progressively governed states to be like, hey, we're going to show you how to do this right, so that we then can go to places like Kentucky that are doing this crazy stuff and be like, this is how it's supposed to work, and then make it an issue there.
And there are, I think, a couple of Republicans around the country that are actually trying to do this, are there not?
Yeah, I mean, there are still, thankfully, some Republican secretaries of state who think that their job is to actually make it so people can vote. It's like a very controversial position, I think, within the Republican Party, but there are some who are doing it. You know, I haven't looked at the latest stuff in Washington, but Kim Wyman, generally, she's, you know, been really good on all this stuff. I saw where, I'm not sure what all the politics are at play, but in Georgia, I've seen where the Secretary of State there has said like, hey, we're going to go ahead and mail people ballots. I feel like in Georgia, that may be a little bit because people are extra sensitive to this because of all the, you know, malfeasance that came from the last Secretary of State to get himself elected governor in a really questionable way. So there are elements of that. And we have to, A, create good examples to, you know, have comparisons, and then B, we have to create political consequences for politicians who make it harder to vote. We can no longer have this thing where politicians make it harder to vote, and then there's a court case, and then 6 months later, the court case gets resolved, possibly against them. But by then, they're so far distanced from what happened that nobody holds it against them.
Jason, so 100%. And, you know, we have been, as a member of the House of Representatives in Congress now for the past 7+ years, as long as I have been there, the congressional maps in North Carolina have been ruled unconstitutional.
It's incredible.
As long as I have been there.
Yeah.
Right. They've been unconstitutional for like 8 years, and yet there's still elections, and it's rigged. there's an election, there's a lawsuit, the court says, you're right, it was rigged. They go back and try it again, it's rigged again. The court says, hey, you can't do that again. And they come back and this thing keeps going. And they're basically trying to prolong that until the next drawing of district lines. And they've been ordered to redraw those lines multiple times. And the only thing we can do, and in some circumstances, it's even hard then, right, given the way these districts are going. But the only way through that is basically surging the vote, right? Making sure our folks are making sure that everybody is able to get out there and vote, right? And that shouldn't be something that we should be, anyone should be afraid of if you actually have confidence in your policies and your vision, right? If your goal is to actually have this country succeed, you should be able to sit there and say, you know what? If we have a fair playing field, we're gonna win. When you start saying, hey, let's find ways to do this so that we can win without, by tilting the playing field, what it means is that you know that your vision is not, in fact, in the best interest of this country and that you're trying to rig it.
Totally. I mean, it just demonstrates that you're like, people don't like my stuff. And, you know, like, I don't gotta, you know, it's that old saying, like, if you don't have the facts, argue the law. If you don't have the law, argue the facts. If you don't have either, just argue. But this is like a fourth part of it. It's like, and if none of that works, like, just get a different jury. Like that's their thing, is that they just, and it is extremely frustrating. And what I worry about a lot with it is that you've got examples like that, right? Like in North Carolina, for basically the entire cycle of this map, it's been unconstitutional. And then if you draw out from there, it's like, okay, for our generation, you've got what, 2 elections now where the winner of the popular vote didn't take the presidency. And these sort of things, these sort of institutional failures, and then you got stuff like what happened to Stacey Abrams' race in Georgia and everything else, they add up. And what they do is, and I think that this is something that, whether it was originally designed in the Republican approach to this, or whether it's a happy side effect for them, it just chips away at people's faith in the system. And the idea is to get people to throw up their hands and give up. And that's what worries me more than anything about all this, is that after some period of time, what is that breaking point? And I worried about that, to be honest, though, a lot more right after 2016, like when Trump won the presidency and everything. And then, you know, some things happened, the Women's March, the 2018 elections. And I realized, like, I think the answer to that is that they can't break our spirit for this, and they can't break our momentum and our motivation. But I still worry about it, because they still seem pretty set on doing it. The idea that if we just keep chipping away at this and we keep making stuff not work the way it's supposed to, maybe they'll give up. And I just don't ever want to find out. And so we have to turn out like crazy. We have to win by more than one in all these places, because they're going to make it really hard for a lot of our people to show up.
They are, and they will. But we also got a shot to actually do something about it. And you've been doing an awful lot about it. And I am really grateful for all that you have done and all that you continue to do to call attention to these issues and to make sure that at some point here, you got a country that actually lives up to our founding promise that everybody here counts. So, Jason, thank you.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Good to see you. Stay well.
All right, you too.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for your continued commitment to our country, for always stepping forward and your willingness to serve, and telling everybody tonight about how important it is that we, at this critical moment, take advantage of this opportunity to protect our right to vote. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and see you soon. Take care.